Chapter 13. The uneventful days, only outwardly uneventful, slipped by in floods of sunshine, and the servants, watching the four ladies, came to the conclusion there was very little life in them. To the servants, San Salvatore seemed asleep. No one came to tea, nor did the ladies go anywhere to tea. Other tenants in other springs there had been stir and enterprise. The boat had been used. Excursions had been made. Beppo's fly was ordered. People from Mexico came over and spent the day. The house rang with voices. Even sometimes champagne. Life was varied. Life was interesting. But this, what was this? The servants were not even scolded. They were left completely to themselves. They yawned. Perplexing, too, is the entire absence of gentlemen. How could gentlemen keep away from so much beauty? For added up, and even after the subtraction of the old one, the three younger ladies produced a formidable total of that which gentlemen usually sought. Also the evident desire of each lady to spend long hours separated from the other ladies puzzled the servants. The result was a deathly stillness in the house, except at meal times. It might have been as empty as it had been all the winter, for any sounds of life there were. The old lady sat in her room, alone. The dark-eyed lady wandered off alone, loitering, so Domenico told them, who sometimes came across her in the course of his duties, incomprehensibly among the rocks. A very beautiful fair lady lay in her low chair in the top garden, alone. The less, but still beautiful, fair lady went up the hills and stayed up them for hours, alone. And every day the sun blazed slowly round the house and disappeared at evening into the sea, and nothing at all had happened. The servants yawned. Yet the four visitors, while their bodies sat. That was Mrs. Fisher's, or lay. That was Lady Caroline's. Or loitered. That was Mrs. Arbuthnot's. Or went, in solitude, up into the hills. That was Mrs. Wilkins's. Or anything but torpid, really. Their minds were unusually busy. Even at night, their minds were busy. And the dreams they had were clear, thin, quick things, entirely different from the heavy dreams of home. There was that in the atmosphere of San Salvatore which produced active-mindedness in all except the natives. They, as before, whatever the beauty around them, whatever the prodigal seasons did, remained immune from thoughts other than those they were accustomed to. All their lives they had seen, year by year, the amazing recurrent spectacle of April in the gardens, and custom had made it invisible to them. They were as blind to it, as unconscious of it, as Domenico's dog asleep in the sun. The visitors could not be blind to it. It was too arresting after London in a particularly wet and gloomy March. Suddenly, to be transported to that place where the air was so still that it held its breath, where the light was so golden that the most ordinary things were transfigured. To be transported into that delicate warmth, that caressing fragrance, and to have the old gray castle as the setting. And in the distance, the serene clear hills with Perugini's backgrounds was an astonishing contrast. Even Lady Caroline, used all her life to beauty, who had been everywhere and seen everything, felt the surprise of it. It was, that year, a particularly wonderful spring, and of all the months at San Salvatore April, if the weather was fine, was best. May scorched and withered. March was restless, and could be hard and cold in its brightness. But April came along softly like a blessing. And if it were a fine April, it was so beautiful that it was impossible not to feel different, not to feel stirred and touched. Mrs. Wilkins, we have seen, responded to it instantly. She, so to speak, at once flung off all her garments and dived straight into glory, unhesitatingly, with a cry of rapture. Mrs. Arbuthnot was stirred and touched, but differently. She had odd sensations presently to be described. Mrs. Fisher, being old, was of a closer, more impermeable texture, and offered more resistance. But she, too, had odd sensations also in her place to be described. Lady Caroline, already amply acquainted with beautiful houses and climates, to whom they could not come quite with the same surprise, yet was very nearly as quick to react as Mrs. Wilkins. The place had an almost instantaneous influence on her as well, and of one part of the influence she was aware. That had made her, beginning on the very first evening, want to think, and acted on her curiously like a conscience. What this conscience seemed to press upon her notice with an insistence that startled her. Lady Caroline hesitated to accept the word, but it would keep on coming into her head. She must think that out. The morning after the first dinner together, she woke up in a condition of regret that she should have been so talkative to Mrs. Wilkins the night before. What had made her be, he wondered. Now, of course, Mrs. Wilkins would want to grab. She would want to be inseparable. And the thought of a grabbing and an inseparableness that should last 4 weeks made Scrap's spirit swoon within her. No doubt the encouraged Mrs. Wilkins would be lurking in the top garden, waiting to waylay her when she went out, and would hail her with morning cheerfulness. How much she hated being hailed with morning cheerfulness, or indeed, hailed at all. She oughtn't to have encouraged Mrs. Wilkins the night before. Fatal to encourage. It was bad enough not to encourage, for just sitting there and saying nothing seemed usually to involve her, but actively to encourage was suicidal. What on earth had made her? Now she would have to waste all the precious time, the precious, lovely time for thinking in, for getting square with herself, in shaking Mrs. Wilkins off, with great caution and on the tips of her toes, balancing herself carefully. Lest the pebbles should scrunch, she stole out when she was dressed to her corner. But the garden was empty. No shaking off was necessary. Neither Mrs. Wilkins nor anybody else was to be seen. She had it entirely to herself, except for Domenico, who presently came and hovered, watering his plants. Again, especially all the plants that were nearest her. No one came out at all. And when, after a long while of following up thoughts which seemed to escape her just as she had got them, and dropping off exhausted to sleep in the intervals of this chase, she felt hungry and looked at her watch and saw that it was past 3. She realized that nobody had even bothered to call her in to lunch, so that Scrap could not but remark, if anyone was shaken off, it was she herself. Well, but how delightful, and how very new. Now she would really be able to think uninterruptedly, delicious to be forgotten. Still, she was hungry. And Mrs. Wilkins, after that excess of friendliness the night before, might at least have told her lunch was ready. And she had really been excessively friendly. So nice about Mellersh's sleeping arrangements, wanting him to have the spare room and all. She wasn't usually interested in arrangements. In fact, she wasn't ever interested in men. So that Scrap considered, she might be said almost to have gone out of her way to be agreeable to Mrs. Wilkins. And in return, Mrs. Wilkins didn't even bother whether or not she had any lunch. Fortunately, though she was hungry, she didn't mind missing a meal. Life was full of meals. They took up an enormous proportion of one's time, and Mrs. Fisher she was afraid, one of those persons who at meals linger. Twice now had she dined with Mrs. Fisher, and each time she had been difficult at the end to dislodge, lingering on slowly cracking innumerable nuts and slowly drinking a glass of wine that seemed as if it would never be finished. Probably it would be a good thing to make a habit of missing lunch. And as it was quite easy to have tea brought out to her, and as she breakfasted in her room only once a day, would she have to sit at the dining room table and endure the nuts. Scrap burrowed her head comfortably in the cushions, and with her feet crossed on the low parapet, gave herself up to more thought. She said to herself, as she had said at intervals throughout the morning, "Now I'm going to think." But, never having thought out anything in her life, it was difficult. Extraordinary how one's attention wouldn't stay fixed. Extraordinary how one's mind slipped sideways, settling herself down to a review of her past as a preliminary to the consideration of her future, and hunting in it, to begin with, for any justification of that distressing word tawdry. The next thing she knew was that she wasn't thinking about this at all, but had somehow switched on to Mr. Wilkins. Well, Mr. Wilkins was quite easy to think about, though not pleasant. She viewed his approach with misgivings, for not only was it a profound and unexpected bore to have a man added to the party, and a man, too, of the kind she was sure Mr. Wilkins must be, but she was afraid. And her fear was the result of a drearily unvarying experience that he might wish to hang about her. This possibility had evidently not yet occurred to Mrs. Wilkins, and it was not one to which she could very well draw her attention. Not, that is, without being too fatuous to live. She tried to hope that Mr. Wilkins would be a wonderful exception to the dreadful rule. If only he were, she would be so much obliged to him that she believed she might really quite like him. But she had misgivings. Suppose he hung about her so that she was driven from her lovely top garden. Suppose the light in Mrs. Wilkins's funny, flickering face was blown out. Scrap felt she would particularly dislike this to happen to Mrs. Wilkins's face. Yet she had never in her life met any wives, not any at all, who had been able to understand that she didn't in the least want their husbands. Often, she had met wives who didn't want their husbands either, but that made them none the less indignant if they thought somebody else did. And none the less sure, when they saw them hanging round Scrap, that she was trying to get them The bare thought, the bare recollection of these situations filled her with a boredom so extreme that it instantly sent her to sleep again. When she woke up, he went on with Mr. Wilkins. Now, if thoughts scrap, Mr. Wilkins were not an exception and behaved in the usual way, would Mrs. Wilkins understand, or would it just simply spoil her holiday? She seemed quick, but would she be quick about just this? She seemed to understand and see inside one, but would she understand and see inside one when it came to Mr. Wilkins? The experienced Scrap was full of doubts. She shifted her feet on the parapet. She jerked a cushion straight. Perhaps she had better try and explain to Mrs. Wilkins, during the days still remaining before the arrival. Explain in a general way, rather vague, and talking at large, her attitude towards such things. She might also expound to her peculiar dislike of people's husbands, and her profound craving to be, at least for this 1 month, let alone. But Scrap had her doubts about this too. Such talk meant a certain familiarity, meant embarking on a friendship with Mrs. Wilkins. And if, after having embarked on it, and faced the peril it contained of too much Mrs. Wilkins, Mr. Wilkins should turn out to be artful. And people did get very artful when they were set on anything, and manage after all to slip through into the top garden, Mrs. Wilkins might easily believe she had been taken in, and that she, Scrap, was deceitful. And about Mr. Wilkins. Wives were really pathetic. At 4:30, she heard sounds of saucers on the other side of the daphne bushes. Was tea being sent out to her?
No. The sounds came no closer. They stopped near the house.
Tea was to be in the garden, in her garden. Scrap considered she might at least have been asked if she minded being disturbed. They all knew she sat there. Perhaps someone would bring hers to her, in her corner. No, nobody brought anything. Well, she was too hungry not to go and have it with the others today, but she would give Francesca strict orders for the future. She got up and walked with that slow grace, which was another of her outrageous number of attractions towards the sounds of tea. She was conscious not only of being very hungry, but of wanting to talk to Mrs. Wilkins again. Mrs. Wilkins had not grabbed. She had left her quite free all day, in spite of the rapprochement the night before. Of course she was an original, and put on a silk jumper for dinner, which she hadn't grabbed. This was a great thing. Scrap went towards the tea table, quite looking forward to Mrs. Wilkins. And when she came in sight of it, she saw only Mrs. Fisher and Mrs. Arbuthnot. Mrs. Fisher was pouring out the tea, and Mrs. Arbuthnot was offering Mrs. Fisher macaroons. Every time Mrs. Fisher offered Mrs. Arbuthnot anything, her cup or milk or sugar, Mrs. Arbuthnot offered her macaroons, pressed them on her with an odd assiduousness, almost with obstinacy. Was it a game? Scrap wondered, sitting down and seizing a macaroon. Where is Mrs. Wilkins? Ask Scrap. They did not know. At least Mrs. Arbuthnot, on Scrap's inquiry, did not know. Mrs. Fisher's face, at the main, became elaborately uninterested. It appeared that Mrs. Wilkins had not been seen since breakfast. Mrs. Arbuthnot thought she had probably gone for a picnic. Scrap missed her. She ate the enormous macaroons, the best and biggest she had ever come across, in silence. Tea without Mrs. Wilkins was dull, and Mrs. Arbuthnot had that fatal flavor of motherliness about her, of wanting to pet one, to make one very comfortable, coaxing one to eat, coaxing her, who was already, so frankly, so even excessively, eating, that seemed to have dogged scrap steps through life. Couldn't people leave one alone? She was perfectly able to eat what she wanted, uninciting. She tried to quench Mrs. Arbuthnot's zeal by being short with her. Useless. The shortness was not apparent. It remained, as all Scrap's evil feelings remained, covered up by the impenetrable veil of her loveliness. Mrs. Fisher sat monumentally and took no notice of either of them. She had had a curious day and was a little worried. She had been quite alone, for none of the three had come to lunch, and none of them had taken the trouble to let her know they were not coming. And Mrs. Arbuthnot, drifting casually into tea, had behaved oddly till Lady Caroline joined them and distracted her attention. Mrs. Fisher was prepared not to dislike Mrs. Arbuthnot, whose parted hair and mild expression seemed very decent and womanly. But she certainly had habits that were difficult to like. Her habit of instantly echoing any offer made her of food or drink, of throwing the offer back on one, as it were, was not somehow what one expected of her. "Will you have some more tea?" was surely a question to which the answer was simply yes or no. But Mrs. Arbuthnot persisted in the trick she had exhibited the day before at breakfast, of adding to her yes or no the words, "Will you?" She had done it again that morning at breakfast, and here she was doing it at tea. The two meals at which Mrs. Fisher presided and poured out. Why did she do it? Mrs. Fisher failed to understand, but this was not what was worrying her. This was merely by the way. What was worrying her was that she had been quite unable that day to settle to anything, and had done nothing but wander restlessly from her sitting room to her battlements and back again. It had been a wasted day, and how much she disliked waste. She had tried to read, and she had tried to write to Kate Lumley. But no, a few words read, a few lines written, and up she got again, and went out onto the battlements and stared at the sea. It did not matter that the letter to Kate Lumley should not be written. There was time enough for that. But the others suppose her coming was definitely fixed. All the better. So would Mr. Wilkins be kept out of the spare room and put where he belonged? Kate would keep. She could be held in reserve. Kate in reserve was just as potent as Kate in actuality. And the reports about Kate in reserve, which might be missing from Kate in actuality. For instance, if Mrs. Fisher were going to be restless, she would rather Kate were not there to see. There was a want of dignity about restlessness, about trotting backwards and forwards. But it didn't matter that she could not read a sentence of any of her great dead friends' writings. No, not even of Browning's, who had been so much in Italy, nor of Ruskin's, whose Stones of Venice she had brought with her to reread so nearly on the very spot. Nor even a sentence of a really interesting book, like the one she had found in her sitting room about the home life of the German Emperor Poor Man. Written in the 90s, when he had not yet begun to be more sinned against than sinning, which was. She was firmly convinced what was the matter with him now, and full of exciting things about his birth and his right arm and accoucheurs, without having to put it down and go and stare at the sea. Reading was very important. The proper exercise and development of one's mind was a paramount duty. How could one read if one were constantly trotting in and out? Curious, this restlessness. Was she going to be ill? No, she felt well. Indeed, unusually well. And she went in and out quite quickly, trotted, in fact, and without her stick. Very odd that she shouldn't be able to sit still, she thought, frowning across the tops of some purple hyacinths at the Gulf of Spezia, glittering beyond the headland. Very odd that she, who walked so slowly, with such dependence on her stick, should suddenly trot. It would be interesting to talk to someone about it, she felt. Not to Kate, to a stranger. Kate would only look at her and suggest a cup of tea. Kate always suggested cups of tea. Besides, Kate had a flat face that Mrs. Wilkins, now annoying as she was, loose-tongued as she was, impertinent, objectionable, would probably understand and perhaps know what was making her be like this. But she could say nothing to Mrs. Wilkins. She was the last person to whom one would admit sensations. Dignity alone forbade it. Confide in Mrs. Wilkins. Never. And Mrs. Arbuthnot, while she wistfully mothered the obstructive scrap at tea, felt too that she had had a curious day. Like Mrs. Fisher's, it had been active, but unlike Mrs. Fisher's, only active in mind. Her body had been quite still. Her mind had not been still at all. It had been excessively active. For years, she had taken care to have no time to think. Her scheduled life in the parish had prevented memories and desires from intruding on her. That day, they had crowded. She went back to 2 feeling dejected. And that she should feel dejected in such a place, with everything about her to make her rejoice, only dejected her the more. How could she rejoice alone? How could anybody rejoice and enjoy and appreciate, really appreciate, alone? Except Lotty. Lotty seemed able to. He had gone off down the hill directly after breakfast, alone, yet obviously rejoicing, for she had not suggested that Rose should go too, and she was singing as she went. Rose had spent the day by herself, sitting with her hands clasping her knees, staring straight in front of her. What she was staring at were the gray swords of the agaves, and on their tall stalks, the pale irises that grew in the remote place she had found, while beyond them, between the gray leaves and the blue flowers, she saw the sea. The place she had found was a hidden corner where the sun-baked stones were padded with thyme, and nobody was likely to come. It was out of sight and sound of the house. It was off any path. It was near the end of the promontory. Unfortunately, she sat so quiet that presently lizards darted over her feet, and some tiny birds like finches, frightened away at first, came back again and flitted among the bushes round her just as if she hadn't been there. How beautiful it was.
And what was the good of it? With no one there, no one who loved being with one, who belonged to one, to whom one could say, "Look."
And wouldn't one say, "Look, dearest"? Yes, one would say dearest, and the sweet word, just to say it to somebody who loved one, would make one happy. She sat quite still, staring straight in front of her. Strange that in this place she did not want to pray. She who had prayed so constantly at home didn't seem able to do it here at all. Her first morning she had merely thrown up a brief thank you to heaven on getting out of bed, and had gone straight to the window to see what everything looked like. Thrown out the thank you as carelessly as a ball, and thought no more about it. That morning, remembering this and ashamed, she had knelt down with determination. But perhaps determination was bad for prayers, for she had been unable to think of a thing to say. And as for her bedtime prayers, on neither of the nights had she said a single one. She had forgotten them. She had been so much absorbed in other thoughts that she had forgotten them. And once in bed, she was asleep and whirling along among bright, thin, swift dreams before she had so much time as to stretch herself out. What had come over her? Why had she let go the anchor of prayer? And she had difficulty too in remembering her poor, in remembering even that there were such things as poor. Holidays, of course, were good, and were recognized by everybody as good. But ought they so completely to blot out, to make such havoc of the realities? Perhaps it was healthy to forget her poor. With all the greater gusto would she go back to them. But it couldn't be healthy to forget her prayers, and still less could it be healthy not to mind. Rose did not mind. She knew she did not mind. And even worse, she knew she did not mind. Not minding. In this place, she was indifferent to both the things that had filled her life and made it seem as if it were happy for years. Well, if only she could rejoice in her wonderful new surroundings. Have that much, at least, to set against the indifference. For letting go, but she could not. She had no work. She did not pray. She was left empty. Lottie had spoiled her day, that day, as she had spoiled her day the day before. Lottie, with her invitation to her husband, with her suggestion that she too should invite hers. So, having flown Frederick into her mind again the day before, Lottie had left her. For the whole afternoon, she had left her alone with her thoughts. Since then, they had been all of Frederick. Where at Hampstead he came to her only in her dreams. Here he left her dreams free and was with her during the day instead. And again that morning, as she was struggling not to think of him, Lottie had asked her, just before disappearing singing down the path, if she had written yet and invited him. And again, he was flung into her mind, and she wasn't able to get him out. How could she invite him? It had gone on so long, their estrangement, such years. She would hardly know what words to use. And besides, he would not come. Why should he come? He didn't care. about being with her. What could they talk about? Between them was the barrier of his work and her religion. She could not. How could she, believing as she did in purity, in responsibility for the effect of one's actions on others, bear his work, bear living by it? And she knew, had at first resented and then been merely bored by her religion. He had let her slip away. He had given her up. He no longer minded. He accepted her religion indifferently as a settled fact. Both it and she, Rose's mind, becoming more luminous in the clear light of April at San Salvatore, suddenly saw the truth. Bored him. Naturally, when she saw this, when that morning it flashed upon her for the first time, she did not like it. She liked it so little that for a space the whole beauty of Italy was blotted out. What was to be done about it? She could not give up believing in good and not liking evil, and it must be evil to live entirely on the proceeds of adulteries, however dead and distinguished they were. Besides, if she did, if she sacrificed her whole past, her bringing up, her work for the last 10 years, would she bore him less? Rose felt right down at her very roots that if you have once thoroughly bored somebody, it is next to impossible to unbore him. Once a bore, always a bore. Certainly, she thought to the person originally bored. Then, thought she, looking out to sea through eyes grown misty, better cling to her religion. It was better, she hardly noticed the reprehensibleness of her thought, than nothing. But, oh, she wanted to cling to something tangible, to love. Something living. Something that one could hold against one's heart, that one could see and touch and do things for. If her poor baby hadn't died, babies didn't get bored with one. It took them a long while to grow up and find one out. And perhaps one's baby never did find one out. Perhaps one would always be to it, however old and bearded it grew. Somebody special, somebody different from everyone else. And if for no other reason precious in that one could never be repeated. Sitting with dim eyes, looking out to sea, she felt an extraordinary yearning to hold something of her very own tight to her bosom. Rose was slender and as reserved in figure as in character. Yet she felt a queer sensation of, like, how could she describe it? Bosom. There's something about San Salvatore but made her feel all bosom. She wanted to gather to her bosom, to comfort and protect, soothing the dear head that should lie on it, its softest strokings and murmurs of love. Frederick's child, come to her, tillowed on her, because they were unhappy, because they had been hurt. They would need her then, if they had been hurt. They would let themselves be loved then, if they were unhappy. Well, the child who was gone would never come now. But perhaps Frederick, someday, when he was old and tired. Such were Mrs. Arbuthnot's reflections and emotions that first day at San Salvatore by herself. She went back to tea dejected as she had not been for years. San Salvatore had taken her carefully built-up semblance of happiness away from her, and given her nothing in exchange. Yes, it had given her yearnings in exchange, this ache and longing, this queer feeling of bosom. But that was worse than nothing. And she, who had learned balance, who never at home, was irritated but always able to be kind, could not, even in her dejection. That afternoon endure Mrs. Fisher's assumption of the position as hostess at tea. One would have supposed that such a little thing would not have touched her, but it did. Was her nature changing? Was she to be not only thrown back on long-stifled yearnings after Frederick, but also turned into somebody who wanted to fight over little things? After tea, when both Mrs. Fisher and Lady Caroline had disappeared again, it was quite evident that nobody wanted her. She was more dejected than ever, overwhelmed by the discrepancy between the splendor outside her, the warm teeming beauty and self-sufficiency of nature, and the blank emptiness of her heart. Then came Lotty, back to dinner, incredibly more freckled, exuding the sunshine she had been collecting all day, talking, laughing, being tactless, being unwise, being without reticence. And Lady Caroline, so quiet at tea, woke up to animation, and Mrs. Fisher was not so noticeable. And Rose was beginning to revive a little, for Lottie's spirits were contagious, as she described the delights of her day, a day which might easily to anyone else have had nothing in it but a very long and very hot walk in sandwiches, when she suddenly said, catching Rose's eye, "Letter gone?" Rose flushed. This tactlessness. "What letter?" asked Scrap, interested. Both her elbows were on the table and her chin was supported in her hands, for the nut stage had been reached. And there was nothing for it but to wait in as comfortable a position as possible till Mrs. Fisher had finished cracking. "Asking her husband here," said Lottie. Mrs. Fisher looked up. Another husband? Was there to be no end to them? Nor was this one, then, a widow either. But her husband was no doubt a decent, respectable man, following a decent, respectable calling. She had little hope of Mr. Wilkins. So little, but she had refrained from inquiring what he did. "Has it?" persisted Lottie, as Rose said nothing. "No," said Rose. "Oh, well, tomorrow then," said Lottie. Rose wanted to say no again to this. Lottie would have in her place, and would, besides, have expounded all her reasons. But she could not turn herself inside out like that, and invite any and everybody to come and look. How was it that Lottie, who saw so many things, didn't see stuck on her heart, and seeing keep quiet about it, the sore place that was Frederick? "Who is your husband?" asked Mrs. Fisher, carefully adjusting another nut between the crackers. "Who should he be?" said Rose quickly, roused at once by Mrs. Fisher to irritation, "except Mr. Arbuthnot." "I mean, of course, what is Mr. Arbuthnot?" And Rose, unpainfully red at this, said after a tiny pause, "My husband." Naturally, Mrs. Fisher was incensed. She couldn't have believed it, of this one, with her decent hair and gentle voice, that she too should be impertinent. Chapter 14. That first week, the wisteria began to fade, and the flowers of the Judas tree and peach trees fell off and carpeted the ground with rose color. And all the freesias disappeared, and the irises grew scarce. And then, while these were clearing themselves away, the double Banksia roses came out. And the big summer roses suddenly flaunted gorgeously on the walls and trellises. So Fortune's yellow was one of them. Very beautiful rose, yellow because. Presently, the tamarisk and the daphnis were at their best, and the lilies at their tallest. By the end of the week, the fig trees were giving shade. The plum blossom was out among the olives. The modest regalias appeared in their fresh pink clothes, and on the rocks sprawled masses of thick-leaved, star-shaped flowers, some vivid purple, and some a clear, pale lemon. By the end of the week, too, Mr. Wilkins arrived, even as his wife had foreseen he would. So he did. And there were signs almost of eagerness about his acceptance of her suggestion, for he had not waited to write a letter in answer to hers, but had telegraphed. Actually was eager. It showed, Scrap thought, a definite wish for reunion. And watching his wife's happy face, and aware of her desire that Mellersh should enjoy his holiday, she told herself that he would be a very unusual fool should he waste his time bothering about anybody else. If he isn't nice to her, Scrap thought, he shall be taken to the battlements and tipped over. Or, by the end of the week, she and Mrs. Wilkins had become Caroline and Lotty to each other, and were friends. Mrs. Wilkins had always been friends, but Scrap had struggled not to be. She had tried hard to be cautious, but how difficult was caution with Mrs. Wilkins? Free herself from every vestige of it. She was so entirely unreserved, so completely expansive, that soon Scrap, almost before she knew what she was doing, was being unreserved too. And nobody could be more unreserved than Scrap when she let herself go. The only difficulty about Lottie was that she was nearly always somewhere else. You couldn't catch her. You couldn't pin her down to come and talk. Scrap's fears that she would grab seemed grotesque in retrospect. Why, there was no grab in her. At dinner and after dinner were the only times one really saw her. All day long she was invisible, and would come back in the late afternoon, looking a perfect sight, her hair full of bits of moss, and her freckles worse than ever. Perhaps she was making the most of her time before Mellersh arrived to do all the things she wanted to do, and meant to devote herself afterwards to going about with him, tidy and in her best clothes. Scrap watched her, interested in spite of herself, because it seemed so extraordinary to be as happy as all that on so little. San Salvatore was beautiful, and the weather was divine. But scenery and weather had never been enough for Scrap. And how could they be enough for somebody who would have to leave them quite soon and go back to life in Hampstead? Also, there was the imminence of Mellersh, of that Mellersh from whom Lottie had so lately run. It was all very well to feel one ought to share, and to make a beau geste, and do it. But the beau gestes Scrap had known hadn't made anybody happy. Nobody really liked being the object of one, and it always meant an effort on the part of the maker. Still, she had to admit, there was no effort about Lottie. It was quite plain that everything she did and said was effortless, and that she was just simply completely happy. And so, Mrs. Wilkins was, for her doubts as to whether she had had time to become steady enough in serenity to go on being serene in Mellersh's company, and she had it uninterruptedly, right round the clock, had gone by the middle of the week. And she felt that nothing now could shake her. She was ready for anything. She was firmly grafted, rooted, built into heaven. Whatever Mellersh said or did, she would not budge an inch out of heaven, would not rouse herself a single instant to come outside it and be cross. On the contrary, she was going to pull him up into it beside her, and they would sit comfortably together, suffused in light, and laugh at how much afraid of him she used to be in Hampstead, and at how deceitful her afraidness had made her. But he wouldn't need much pulling. He would come in quite naturally after a day or two, irresistibly wafted on the scented breezes of that divine air. And there he would sit arrayed in stars, thought Mrs. Wilkins, in whose mind, among much other debris, floated occasional bright shreds of poetry. She laughed to herself a little at the picture of Mellersh, that top-hatted, black-coated, respectable family solicitor, arrayed in stars. But she laughed affectionately, almost in maternal pride, in how splendid he would look in such fine clothes. Poor lamb, she murmured to herself, affectionately, and added, what he wants is a thorough air. This was during the first half of the week. By the beginning of the last half, at the end of which Mr. Wilkins arrived, she left off even assuring herself that she was unshakable, that she was permeated beyond altering by the atmosphere. She no longer thought of it or noticed it. She took it for granted. If one may say so, and she certainly said so, not only to herself, but also to Lady Caroline. She had found her celestial legs. Contrary to Mrs. Fisher's idea of the seemly, but of course contrary. What else would one expect of Mrs. Wilkins? She did not go to meet her husband at Mezzago, but merely walked down to the point where Beppo's fly would leave him and his luggage in the street of Castagneto. Mrs. Fisher disliked the arrival of Mr. Wilkins, and was sure that anybody who could have married Mrs. Wilkins must be at least of an injudicious disposition. But a husband, whatever his disposition, should be properly met. Mr. Fisher had always been properly met. Never once in his married life had he gone unmet at a station, nor had he ever not been seen off. These observances, these courtesies, strengthened the bonds of marriage, and made the husband feel he could rely on his wife's being always there. Always being there was the essential secret for a wife. What would have become of Mr. Fisher if she had neglected to act on this principle? She preferred not to think. Enough things became of him as it was, for whatever one's care in stopping up married life yet seemed to contain chinks. But Mrs. Wilkins took no pains. She just walked down the hill singing. Mrs. Fisher could hear her, and picked up her husband in the street, as casually as if he were a pin. The three others, still in bed, for it was not nearly time to get up, heard her as she passed beneath their windows down the zigzag path to meet Mr. Wilkins, who was coming by the morning train. And Scrap smiled, and Rose sighed, and Mrs. Disher rang her bell and desired Francesca to bring her breakfast in her room. All three had breakfast that day in their rooms, moved by a common instinct to take cover. Scrap always breakfasted in bed, but she had the same instinct for cover. And during breakfast she made plans for spending the whole day where she was. Perhaps, though, it wouldn't be as necessary that day as the next. Back day, Scrap calculated, Mellersh would be provided for. He would want to have a bath, and having a bath at San Salvatore was an elaborate business, a real adventure, if one had a hot one in the bathroom. And it took a lot of time. It involved the attendance of the entire staff. Domenico and the boy Giuseppe coaxing the patent stove to burn, restraining it when it burnt too fiercely, using the bellows to it when it threatened to go out, relighting it when it did go out. Francesca anxiously hovering over the tap, regulating its trickle, because if it were turned on too full, the water instantly ran cold, and if not full enough, the stove blew up inside and mysteriously flooded the house. And Costanza and Angela running up and down, bringing pails of hot water from the kitchen to eke out what the tap did. This bath had been put in lately, and was at once the pride and the terror of the servants. It was very patent. Don't know, but he quite understood it. There were long printed instructions as to its right treatment hanging on the wall, in which the word pericoloso recurred. When Mrs. Fisher, proceeding on her arrival to the bathroom, saw this word, she went back to her room again and ordered a sponge bath instead. And when the others found what using the bathroom meant, and how reluctant the servants were to leave them alone with the stove, and how Francesca positively refused to, and stayed with her, back-turned, watching the tap, and how the remaining servants waited anxiously outside the door till the bather came safely out again. They, too, had sponge baths brought into their rooms and said. Mr. Wilkins, however, was a man, and would be sure to want a big bath. Having it, Scrap calculated, would keep him busy for a long while. Then he would unpack, and then, after his night in the train, he would probably sleep till the evening. So, would he be provided for the whole of that day, and not be let loose on them till dinner? Therefore, Scrap came to the conclusion she would be quite safe in the garden that day, and got up as usual after breakfast. Scrap dawdled, as usual, through her dressing, listening with a slightly cocked ear to the sounds of Mr. Wilkins's arrival, of his luggage being carried into Lottie's room on the other side of the landing, of his educated voice as he inquired of Lottie, first, Do I give this fellow anything? And immediately afterwards, can I have a hot bath? Of Lottie's voice cheerfully assuring him that he needn't give the fellow anything, because he was the gardener, and that yes, he could have a hot bath. And soon after this, the landing was filled with the familiar noises of wood being bought, of water being bought, of feet running, of tongues vociferating. In fact, for the preparation of the bath, Scrap finished dressing, and then loitered at her window, waiting till she should hear Mr. Wilkins go into the bathroom. When he was safely there, she would slip out and settle herself in her garden, and resume her inquiries into the probable meaning of her life. She was getting on with her inquiries. She dozed much less frequently, and was beginning to be inclined to agree that tawdry was the word to apply to her past. Also, she was afraid that her future looked black. She could hear Mr. Wilkins' educated voice again. Lottie's door had opened, and he was coming out of it, asking his way to the bathroom. "It's where you see the crowd," Lottie's voice answered, still a cheerful voice Scrap was glad to notice. His steps went along the landing, and Lottie's steps seemed to go downstairs. And then there seemed to be a brief altercation at the bathroom door. Hardly so much an altercation as a chorus of vociferations on one side, and a wordless determination. Scrap judged to have a bath by oneself on the other. Mr. Wilkins knew no Italian, and the expression pericoloso left him precisely as it found him, or would have if he had seen it. But naturally he took no notice of the printed matter on the wall. He firmly closed the door on the servants, resisting Domenico. He tried to the last to press through, and locked himself in as a man should for his bath, judicially considering as he made his simple preparations for getting in the singular standard of behavior of these foreigners, who, both male and female, apparently wished to stay with him while he bathed. In Finland, he had heard the female natives not only were present on such occasions, but actually washed the bath-taking traveler. He had not heard, however, that this was true too of Italy, which somehow seemed much nearer civilization. Perhaps because one went there and did not go to Finland. In partially examining this reflection, and carefully balancing the claims to civilization of Italy and Finland, Mr. Wilkins got into the bath and turned off the tap. Naturally, he turned off the tap. It was what one did. But on the instructions, printed in red letters, was a paragraph saying that the tap should not be turned off, as long as there was still fire in the stove. It should be left on, not much on, but on, until the fire was quite out. Otherwise, and here again was the word pericoloso, the stove would blow up. Mr. Wilkins got into the bath, turned off the tap, and the stove blew up exactly as the printed instructions said it would. It blew up, fortunately, only in its inside, but it blew up with a terrific noise. And Mr. Wilkins leapt out of the bath and rushed to the door, and only the instinct born of years of training made him snatch up a towel as he rushed. Scrap, halfway across the landing on her way out of doors, heard the explosion. Good heavens, she thought, remembering the instructions. There goes Mr. Wilkins. And she ran toward the head of the stairs to call the servants. And as she ran, outran Mr. Wilkins, clutching his towel, and they ran into each other. That damn bath, cried Mr. Wilkins, perhaps for the only time in his life forgetting himself, but he was upset. Here was an introduction. Mr. Wilkins, imperfectly concealed in his towel, his shoulders exposed at one end, and his legs at the other. And Lady Caroline Dester, to meet whom he had swallowed all his anger with his wife, and come out to Italy. For Lottie in her letter had told him who was at San Salvatore, besides herself and Mrs. Arbuthnot. And Mr. Wilkins at once had perceived that this was an opportunity which might never recur. Lottie had merely said, "There are 2 other women here, Mrs. Fisher and Lady Caroline Dester." But that was enough. He knew all about the Droitwiches, their wealth, their connections, their place in history, and the power they had, should they choose to exert it, of making yet another solicitor happy by adding him to those they already employed. Some people employed one solicitor for one branch of their affairs, and another for another. The affairs of the Droitwiches must have many branches. He had also heard, for it was, he considered, part of his business to hear, and having heard to remember of the beauty of their only daughter. Even if the Droitwiches themselves did not need his services, their daughter might. Beauty led one into strange situations. Advice can never come amiss. And should none of them, neither parents nor daughter, nor any of their brilliant sons, need him in his professional capacity, it yet was obviously a most valuable acquaintance to make. It opened up vistas. It swelled with possibilities. He might go on living in Hampstead for years, and not again come across such another chance. Directly his wife's letter reached him, he telegraphed and packed. This was business. He wasn't a man to lose time when it came to business, nor was he a man to jeopardize a chance by neglecting to be amiable. He met his wife perfectly amiably, aware that amiability under such circumstances was wisdom. Besides, he actually felt amiable. Very. For once, Lottie was really helping him. He kissed her affectionately on getting out of Beppo's fly, and was afraid she must have got up extremely early. He made no complaints of the steepness of the walk up. He told her pleasantly of his journey, and when called upon, obediently admired the views. It was all neatly mapped out in his mind what he was going to do that first day: have a shave, have a bath, put on clean clothes, sleep a while. And then would come lunch and the introduction to Lady Caroline. In the train, he had selected the words of his greeting, going over them with care. Some slight expression of his gratification in meeting one of whom he, in common with the whole world, had heard. But of course, put delicately, very delicately. Some slight reference to her distinguished parents and the part her family had played in the history of England, made, of course, with proper tact. A sentence or two about her eldest brother, Lord Winchcombe, who had won his V.C. in the late war under circumstances. Her eldest brother might or might not add this, every Englishman's heart to beat higher than ever with pride. And the first steps towards what might well be the turning point in his career would have been taken. And here he was. No, it was too terrible. What can be more terrible? Only a towel on, water running off his legs, and that exclamation. He knew at once the lady was Lady Caroline. The minute the exclamation was out, he knew it. Rarely did Mr. Wilkins use that word, and never, never in the presence of a lady or a client. Well, as for the towel, why had he come? Why had he not stayed in Hampstead? It would be impossible to live this down. But Mr. Wilkins was reckoning without scrap. She, indeed, screwed up her face at the first flash of him on her astonished sight in an enormous effort not to laugh. And having choked the laughter down and got her face serious again, she said as composedly as if he had all his clothes on, How do you do? More perfect tact. Mr. Wilkins could have worshipped her. This exquisite ignoring. Blue blood, of course, coming out. Overwhelmed with gratitude, he took her offered hand and said, "How do you do?" in his turn. And merely to repeat the ordinary words seemed magically to restore the situation to the normal. Indeed, he was so much relieved. And it was so natural to be shaking hands, to be conventionally greeting, that he forgot he had only a towel on, and his professional manner came back to him. He forgot what he was looking like. But he did not forget that this was Lady Caroline Dester, the lady he had come all the way to Italy to see. And he did not forget that it was in her face, her lovely and important face, that he had flung his terrible exclamation. He must at once entreat her forgiveness. To say such a word to a lady, to any lady, but of all ladies, to just this one. I'm afraid I used unpardonable language, began Mr. Wilkins very earnestly, as earnestly and ceremoniously as if he had had his clothes on. I thought it most appropriate, said Scrap, who was used to dance. Mr. Wilkins was incredibly relieved and seized by this answer. No offense, then. Taken. Blue blood again. Only blue blood could afford such a liberal and such an understanding attitude. It is Lady Caroline Dester, is it not, to whom I am speaking? He asked, his voice sounding even more carefully cultivated than usual, for he had to restrain. Too much pleasure, too much relief, too much of the joy of the pardoned and the shriven from getting into it. Yes, said Scrap, and for the life of her, she couldn't help smiling. She couldn't help it. She hadn't meant to smile at Mr. Wilkins. Not ever. But really, he looked. And then his voice on the top of the rest of him, oblivious of the towel and his legs, and talking just like a church. Allow me to introduce myself, said Mr. Wilkins, with the ceremony of the drawing room. My name is Mellersh Wilkins. And he instinctively held out his hand a second time at the words. I thought perhaps it was, said Scrap, a second time having hers shaken, and a second time unable not to smile. He was about to proceed to the first of the graceful tributes he had prepared in the train, oblivious, as he could not see himself, that he was without his clothes, when the servants came running up the stairs. And simultaneously, Mrs. Fisher appeared in the doorway of her sitting room. For all this had happened very quickly, and the servants away in the kitchen. And Mrs. Fisher, pacing her battlements, had not had time on hearing the noise to appear before the second handshake. The servants, when they heard the dreaded noise, knew at once what had happened, and rushed straight into the bathroom to try and staunch the flood, taking no notice of the figure on the landing in the towel. But Mrs. Fisher did not know what the noise could be, and coming out of her room to inquire, stood rooted on the doorsill. It was enough to root anybody. Lady Caroline shaking hands with what evidently, if he had had clothes on, would have been Mrs. Wilkins's husband, and both of them conversing just as if. Then Scrap became aware of Mrs. Fisher. She turned to her at once. Do let me, she said gracefully, introduce Mr. Mellersh Wilkins. He has just come." "This," she added, turning to Mr. Wilkins, "is Miss Fisher." And Mr. Wilkins, nothing if not courteous, reacted at once to the conventional formula. First he bowed to the elderly lady in the doorway, then he crossed over to her, his wet feet leaving footprints as he went, and having got to her, he politely held out his hand. "It is a pleasure," said Mr. Wilkins in his carefully modulated voice, "to meet a friend of my wife's." Scrap melted away down into the garden. Chapter 15. The strange effect of this incident was that when they met that evening at dinner, both Mrs. Fisher and Lady Caroline had a singular feeling of secret understanding with Mr. Wilkins. He could not be to them as other men. He could not be to them as he would have been if they had met him in his clothes. There was a sense of broken ice. They felt the core at once intimate and indulgent. Almost they felt to him as nurses do, as those feel who have assisted either patients or young children at their death. They were acquainted with Mr. Wilkins's legs. What Mrs. Fisher said to him that morning, in her first shock, will never be known. But what Mr. Wilkins said to her in reply, when reminded by what she was saying of his condition, was so handsome in its apology, so proper in its confusion, that she had ended by being quite sorry for him, and completely placated. After all, he was an accident, and nobody could help accidents. And then she saw him next at dinner, dressed, polished, spotless as to linen, and sleek as to hair. She felt this singular sensation of a secret understanding with him, and added to it, of a kind of almost personal pride in his appearance, now that he was dressed, which presently extended in some subtle way to an almost personal pride in everything he said. There was no doubt whatever in Mrs. Fisher's mind that a man was infinitely preferable as a companion to a woman. Mr. Wilkins's presence and conversation at once raised the standard of the dinner table from that of a bare garden. Yes, a bare garden, to that of a civilized social gathering. He talked as men talk, about interesting subjects, and, though most courteous to Lady Caroline, showed no traces of dissolving into simpers and idiocy whenever he addressed her. He was indeed precisely as courteous to Mrs. Fisher herself. And when for the first time at that table politics were introduced, he listened to her with the proper seriousness on her exhibiting a desire to speak, and treated her opinions with the attention they deserved. And he appeared to think much as she did about Lloyd George, and in regard to literature he was equally sound. Now, in fact, there was real conversation, and he liked nuts. How he could have married Mrs. Wilkins was a mystery. Lotty, for her part, looked on with round eyes. She had expected Mellersh to take at least 2 days before he got to this stage, but the San Salvatore spell had worked instantly. It was not only that he was pleasant at dinner, for she had always seen him pleasant at dinners with other people, but he had been pleasant all day privately, so pleasant that he had complimented her on her looks while she was brushing out her hair, and kissed her. And it was neither good morning nor good night. Well, this being so, she would put off telling him the truth about her nest egg, and about Rose not being his hostess. After all, till next day. Pity to spoil things. She had been going to blurt it out as soon as he had had a rest. But it did seem a pity to disturb such a very beautiful frame of mind as that of Mellersh's first day. Let him to get more firmly fixed in heaven. Once fixed, he wouldn't mind anything. Her face sparkled with delight at the instantaneous effect of San Salvatore. Even the catastrophe of the bath, of which she had been told when she came in from the garden, had not shaken him. Of course, all that he had needed was a holiday. What a brute she had been to him when he wanted to take her himself to Italy. But this arrangement, as it happened, was ever so much better, though not through any merit of hers. She talked and laughed gaily, not a shred of fear of him left in her. And even when she said, struck by his spotlessness, that he looked so clean that one could eat one's dinner off him. And Scrap laughed, Mellersh laughed, too. He would have minded that at home, supposing that at home she had had the spirit to say it. It was a successful evening. Scrap, whenever she looked at Mr. Wilkins, saw him in his towel, dripping water, and felt indulgent. Mrs. Fisher was delighted with him. Rose was a dignified hostess in Mr. Wilkins's eyes, quiet and dignified. And he admired the way she waived her right to preside at the head of the table, as a graceful compliment, of course, to Mrs. Fisher's age. Mrs. Arbuthnot was, opined Mr. Wilkins, naturally retired. She was the most retiring of the three ladies. He had met her before dinner alone for a moment in the drawing-room, and had expressed in appropriate language his sense of her kindness, and wishing him to join her party. And she had been retiring. Was she shy? Probably she had blushed, and murmured as if in deprecation. And then the others had come in. At dinner she talked least. He would, of course, become better acquainted with her during the next few days, and it would be a pleasure, he was sure. Meanwhile, Lady Caroline was all and more than all Mr. Wilkins had imagined, and had received his speeches, worked and skillfully, between the courses graciously. Mrs. Fisher was the exact old lady he had been hoping to come across all his professional life. And Lottie had not only immensely improved, but was obviously au mieux. Mr. Wilkins knew what was necessary in French with Lady Caroline. He had been much tormented during the day by the thought of how he had stood conversing with Lady Caroline, forgetful of his not being dressed. He had at last written her a note most deeply apologizing, and beseeching her to overlook his amazing, his incomprehensible obliviousness, to which she had replied in pencil on the back of the envelope. Don't worry. And he had obeyed her commands and had put it from him. The result was that he was now in great contentment. Before going to sleep that night, he pinched his wife's ear. She was amazed. These endearments. What is more, the morning brought no relapse in Mr. Wilkins, and he kept up to this high level throughout the day in spite of its being the first day of the second week, and therefore payday. Its being payday precipitated Lottie's confession, which she had, when it came to the point, been inclined to put off a little longer. She was not afraid. She dared anything. But Mellersh was in such an admirable humor. Why risk clouding it just yet? When, however, soon after breakfast, Costanza appeared with a pile of very dirty little bits of paper covered with sums in pencil, and having knocked at Mrs. Fisher's door and been sent away, and at Lady Caroline's door and been sent away, and at Rose's door and had no answer, because Rose had gone out. She waylaid Lotty, who was showing Mellersh over the house, and pointed to the bits of paper, and talked very rapidly and loud, and shrugged her shoulders a great deal, and kept on pointing at the bits of paper. Lotty remembered that a week had passed without anybody paying anything to anyone, and that the moment had come to settle up. "Does this good lady want something?" inquired Mr. Wilkins mellifluously. "Money," said Lotty. "Money?" "It's the housekeeping bills." "Well, you have nothing to do with those," said Mr. Wilkins serenely. "Oh, yes, but I have." And the confession was precipitated. It was wonderful how Mellersh took it. One would have imagined that his sole idea about the nest egg had always been that it should be lavished on just this. He did not, as he would have done at home, cross-examine her. He accepted everything as it came pouring out, about her fibs and all. And when she had finished and said, "You have every right to be angry, I think, but I hope you won't be, and will forgive me instead," he merely asked, "What can be more beneficial than such a holiday?" Whereupon she put her arm through his, and held it tight, and said, "Oh, Mellersh, you really are too sweet." Her face red with pride in him, that he should so quickly assimilate the atmosphere, that he should at once become nothing but kindness, showed surely what a real affinity he had with good and beautiful things. He belonged quite naturally in this place of heavenly calm. He was extraordinary how she had misjudged him. By nature a child of light. Fancy not minding the dreadful fib she had gone in for before leaving home. Fancy passing even those over without comment. Wonderful. Yet not wonderful, for wasn't he in heaven? In heaven nobody minded any of those done, with things one didn't even trouble to forgive and forget. One was much too happy. She pressed his arm tight in her gratitude and appreciation, and though he did not withdraw his, neither did he respond to her pressure. Mr. Wilkins was of a cool habit, and rarely had any real wish to press. Meanwhile, Costanza, perceiving that she had lost the Wilkinses' ear, had gone back to Mrs. Fisher, who at least understood Italian, besides being clearly in the servants' eyes. The one of the party, marked down by age and appearance, to pay the bills. And to her, while Mrs. Fisher put the final touches to her toilette, for she was preparing, by means of putting on a hat and veil, and feather boa, and gloves, to go for her first stroll in the lower garden. Positively, her first since her arrival. She explained that unless she was given money to pay the last week's bills, the shops of Castagneto would refuse credit for the current week's food. Not even credit would they give, affirmed Costanza, who had been spending a great deal, and was anxious to pay all her relations what was owed them, and also to find out how her mistresses took it for that day's meals. Soon it would be the hour of colazione, and how could there be colazione without meat, without fish, without eggs? Mrs. Fisher took the bills out of her hand and looked at the total, and she was so much astonished by its size, so much horrified by the extravagance to which it testified, that she sat down at her writing table to go into the thing thoroughly. Costanza had a very bad half-hour. She had not supposed that it was in the English to be so mercenary, and then Marvecchia, as she was called in the kitchen, knew so much Italian, and with a doggedness that filled Costanza with shame on her behalf, for such conduct was the last one expected from the noble English. She went through item after item, requiring and persisting till she got them. Explanations. There were no explanations, except that Costanza had had one glorious week of doing exactly as she chose, of splendid, unbridled license, and that this was the result. Costanza, having no explanations, wept. It was miserable to think she would have to cook, from now on, under watchfulness, under suspicion. And what would her relations say when they found the orders they received were whittled down? They would say she had no influence. They would despise her. Costanza wept, but Mrs. Fisher was unmoved. And in slow and splendid Italian, with the roll of the canters of the Inferno, she informed her that she would pay no bills till the following week. And that meanwhile, the food was to be precisely as good as ever, and at a quarter the cost. Costanza threw up her hands. Next week proceeded Mrs. Fisher unmoved. If she found this had been so, she would pay the whole. Otherwise, she paused. For what she would do otherwise, she did not know herself. But she paused, and looked impenetrable, majestic, and menacing, and Costanza was cowed. Then Mrs. Fisher, having dismissed her with a gesture, went in search of Lady Caroline to complain. She had been under the impression that Lady Caroline ordered the meals, and therefore was responsible for the prices. But now it appeared that the cook had been left to do exactly as she pleased ever since they got there, which of course was simply disgraceful. Scrap was not in her bedroom, but the room on Mrs. Fisher's opening the door, for she suspected her of being in it, and only pretending not to hear the knock, with still flower-like from her presence. "Scent," sniffed Mrs. Fisher, shutting it again. And she wished Carlyle could have had 5 minutes straight talk with this young woman. And yet, perhaps even he. She went downstairs to go into the garden in search of her, and in the hall encountered Mr. Wilkins. He had his hat on, and was lighting a cigar. Indulgent as Mrs. Fisher felt towards Mr. Wilkins, and peculiarly and even mystically related after the previous morning's encounter, she yet could not like a cigar in the house. Out of doors, she endured it. But it was not necessary, when out of doors was such a big place, to indulge the habit indoors. Even Mr. Fisher, she should say, a man originally tenacious of habits, had quite soon after marriage got out of this one. However, Mr. Wilkins, snatching off his hat on seeing her, instantly threw the cigar away. He threw it into the water, a great jar of arum lilies presumably contained. Mrs. Fisher, aware of the value men attached to their newly lit cigars, could not but be impressed by this immediate and magnificent amenity, honorable. But the cigar did not reach the water. It got caught in the lilies and smoked on by itself among them, a strange and depraved-looking object. "Where are you going to, my prep?" began Mr. Wilkins, advancing towards Mrs. Fisher. But he broke off just in time. Was it morning spirits impelling him to address Mrs. Fisher in the terms of a nursery rhyme? He wasn't even aware that he knew the thing. Most strange. What could have put it, at such a moment, into his self-possessed head? He felt great respect for Mrs. Fisher, and would not for the world have insulted her by addressing her as a maid, pretty or otherwise. He wished to stand well with her. She was a woman of parts, and also, he suspected, of property. At breakfast, they had been most pleasant together, and he had been struck by her apparent intimacy with well-known persons. Victorians, of course. But it was restful to talk about them after the strain of his brother-in-law's Georgian parties on Hampstead Heath. He and she were getting on famously, he felt. She already showed all the symptoms of presently wishing to become a client. Not for the world would he offend her. He turned a little cold at the narrowness of his escape. She had not, however, noticed. "You are going out," he said very politely, all readiness should she confirm his assumption to accompany her. "I want to find Lady Caroline," said Mrs. Fisher, going towards the glass door leading into the top garden. "An agreeable quest," remarked Mr. Wilkins. "May I assist in the search?" "Allow me," he added, opening the door for her. "She usually sits over in that corner behind the bushes," said Mrs. Fisher, "and I don't know about it being an agreeable quest. She has been letting the bills run up in the most terrible fashion, and needs a good scolding." "Lady Caroline," said Mr. Wilkins, unable to follow such an attitude. "What has Lady Caroline, if I may inquire, to do with the bills here?" "The housekeeping was left to her, and as we all share alike, it ought to have been a matter of honor with her." "But Lady Caroline housekeeping for the party here?" "A party which includes my wife." "My dear lady, you render me speechless. Do you not know she is the daughter of the Droitwiches?" "Oh, is that who she is?" said Mrs. Fisher, scrunching heavily over the pebbles towards the hidden corner. "Well, that accounts for it. The muddle that man Droitwich made in his department in the war was a national scandal. It amounted to misappropriation of the public funds. But it is impossible, I assure you, to expect the daughter of the Droitwiches," began Mr. Wilkins, earnestly. "The Droitwiches," interrupted Mrs. Fisher, "are neither here nor there. Duties undertaken should be performed. I don't intend my money to be squandered for the sake of any Droitwiches. A headstrong old lady, single, perhaps not so easy to deal with as he had hoped. But how wealthy! Only the consciousness of great wealth would make her snap her fingers in this manner at the Droitwiches." Lotty, on being questioned, had been vague about her circumstances, and have described her house as a mausoleum with goldfish swimming about in it. But now he was sure she was more than very well off. Still, he wished he had not joined her at this moment, for he had no sort of desire to be present at such a spectacle as the scolding of Lady Caroline Dester. Again, however, he was reckoning without scrap. Whatever she felt when she looked up and beheld Mr. Wilkins discovering her corner on the very first morning, nothing but angelicness appeared on her face. She took her feet off the parapet on Mrs. Fisher's sitting down on it, and listening gravely to her opening remarks as to her not having any money to fling about in reckless and uncontrolled household expenditure, he interrupted her flow by pulling one of the cushions from behind her head and offering it to her. "Sit on this," said Scrap, holding it out. "You'll be more comfortable." Mr. Wilkins leapt to relieve her of it. "Oh, thanks," said Mrs. Fisher, interrupted. It was difficult to get into the swing again. Mr. Wilkins inserted the cushion solicitously between the slightly raised Mrs. Fisher and the stone of the parapet, and again she had to say thanks. It was interrupted. Besides, Lady Caroline said nothing in her defense. She only looked at her and listened with the face of an attentive angel. It seemed to Mr. Wilkins that it must be difficult to scold a Dester who looked like that, and so exquisitely said nothing. Mrs. Fisher, he was glad to see, gradually found it difficult herself, for her severity slackened, and she ended by saying lamely, "You ought to have told me you were not doing it." "I didn't know you thought I was," said the lovely voice. "I would now like to know," said Mrs. Fisher, "what you propose to do for the rest of the time here." "Nothing," said Scap, smiling. "Nothing. Do you mean to say—" "If I may be allowed, ladies," interposed Mr. Wilkins in his suavest professional manner, "to make a suggestion." They both looked at him, and remembering him as they first saw him, felt indulgent. "I would advise you not to spoil a delightful holiday with worries over housekeeping." "Exactly," said Mrs. Fisher. "It is what I intend to avoid." "Most sensible," said Mr. Wilkins. "Why not, then," he continued, "allow the cook, an excellent cook, by the way, so much a head per diem?" Mr. Wilkins knew what was necessary in Latin. "And tell her that for this sum she must cater for you, and not only cater, but cater as well as ever." One could easily reckon it out. The charges of a moderate hotel, for instance, would do as a basis, halved, or perhaps even quartered. "And this week that has just passed?" asked Mrs. Fisher. "The terrible bills of this first week. What about them?" "They shall be my present to San Salvatore," said Scrap, who didn't like the idea of Lotty's nest egg being reduced so much, beyond what she was prepared for. There was a silence. The ground was cut from under Mrs. Fisher's feet. "Of course, if you choose to throw your money about," she said at last, disapproving but immensely relieved, while Mr. Wilkins was wrapped in the contemplation of the precious qualities of blue blood. "Well, this is readiness, for instance, not to trouble about money. This free-handedness. It was not only what one admired in others, perhaps more than anything else, but it was extraordinarily useful to the professional classes. When met with it, should be encouraged by warmth of reception." Mrs. Fisher was not warm. She accepted, from which he deduced that with her wealth went closeness, but she accepted grudgingly. Presents were presents, and one did not look them in this manner in the mouth, he felt. and if Lady Caroline found her pleasure in presenting his wife and Mrs. Fisher with their entire food for a week, it was their part to accept gracefully. One should not discourage gifts on behalf of his wife. Then Mr. Wilkins expressed what she would wish to express in remarking to Lady Caroline, with a touch of lightness, for so should gifts be accepted in order to avoid embarrassing the donor, that she had in that case been his wife's hostess since her arrival. He turned almost gaily to Mrs. Fisher and pointed out that she and his wife must now jointly write Lady Caroline the customary letter of thanks for hospitality. "A Collins," said Mr. Wilkins, who knew what was necessary in literature. "I prefer the name Collins for such a letter to either that of board and lodging or bread and butter. Let's call it a Collins." Scrap smiled and held out her cigarette case. Mrs. Fisher could not help being mollified. A way out of waste was going to be found, thanks to Mr. Wilkins, and she hated waste quite as much as having to pay for it. Also a way was found out of housekeeping. For a moment, she had thought that if everybody tried to force her into housekeeping on her brief holiday by their own indifference, Lady Caroline, or inability to speak Italian, the other two, she would have to send for Kate Lumley after all. Kate could do it. Kate and she had learned Italian together. Kate would only be allowed to come on condition that she did do it. But this was much better, this way of Mr. Wilkins's. Really, a most superior man. It was nothing like an intelligent, not too young man for profitable and pleasurable companionship. And when she got up, the business for which she had come being settled, and said she now intended to take a little stroll before lunch. Mr. Wilkins did not stay with Lady Caroline, as most of the men she had known would, she was afraid, have wanted to. He asked to be permitted to go and stroll with her, so that he evidently definitely preferred conversation to faces. A sensible, companionable man. A clever, well-read man. A man of the world. A man. She was very glad indeed she had not written to Kate the other day. What did she want with Kate? She had found a better companion. But Mr. Wilkins did not know of Mrs. Fisher, because of her conversation, but because of when she got up and he got up, because she got up. Intending merely to bow her out of the recess, Lady Caroline had put her feet up on the parapet again, and arranging her head sideways in the cushions, had shut her eyes. The daughter of the Droitwiches desired to go to sleep. It was not for him, by remaining, to prevent her. Chapter 16. And so the second week began, and all was harmony. The arrival of Mr. Wilkins, instead of, as 3 of the party had feared, and the 4th had only been protected from fearing by her burning faith in the effect on him of San Salvatore, disturbing such harmony as there was, increased it. He fitted in. He was determined to please, and he did please. He was most amiable to his wife, not only in public, which she was used to, but in private, when he certainly wouldn't have been if he wanted to. He did want to. He was so much obliged to her, so much pleased with her for making him acquainted with Lady Caroline, that he felt really fond of her. Also proud, For there must be, he reflected, a good deal more in her than he had supposed. For Lady Caroline, to have become so intimate with her, and so affectionate. And the more he treated her as though she were really very nice, the more Lottie expanded and became really very nice, and the more he affected in his turn. So that they went round and round, not in a vicious, but in a highly virtuous circle. Positively for him, Mellersh petted her. There was at no time much pet in Mellersh, because he was by nature a cool man. Yet such was the influence on him of, as Lottie supposed, San Salvatore, that in this second week he sometimes pinched both her ears, one after the other, instead of only one.
And Lottie, marveling at such rapidly developing affectionateness, wondered what he would do should he continue at this rate.
In the third week, when her supply of ears would have come to an end, he was particularly nice about the washstand, and genuinely desirous of not taking up too much of the space in the small bedroom. Quick to respond, Lottie was even more desirous not to be in his way, and the room became the scene of many an affectionate combat, de générosité, each of which left them more pleased with each other than ever. He did not again have a bath in the bathroom, though it was mended and ready for him, but got up and went down every morning to the sea, and in spite of the cool nights making the water cold early, had his dip as a man should, and came after breakfast, rubbing his hands and feeling, as he told Mrs. Fisher, prepared for anything. Lottie's belief in the irresistible influence of the heavenly atmosphere of San Salvatore being thus obviously justified. And Mr. Wilkins, whom Rose knew was alarming, and Scrap had pictured as icily unkind, being so evidently a changed man, both Rose and Scrap began to think there might, after all, be something in what Lottie insisted on, and that San Salvatore did work purgingly on the character. They were the more inclined to think so, in that they too felt a working going on inside themselves. They felt more cleared, both of them, that second week. Scrap in her thoughts, many of which were now quite nice thoughts, real amiable ones about her parents and relations, with a glimmer in them of recognition of the extraordinary benefits she had received at the hands of what? Fate, Providence, anyhow of something, and of how, having received them, she had misused them by failing to be happy, and Rose in her bosom, which though it still yearned to some purpose, for she was reaching the conclusion that merely inactively to yearn was no use at all, and that she must either by some means stop her yearning, or give it at least a chance, remote but still a chance of being quieted, by writing to Frederick and asking him to come out. If Mr. Wilkins could be changed, thought Rose, why not Frederick? How wonderful it would be. How too wonderful if the place worked on him too, and were able to make them even a little understand each other, even a little be friends. Rose, so far, had loosening and disintegration gone on in her character. Now, was beginning to think her obstinate straight lacedness about his books, and her austere absorption in good works, had been foolish and perhaps even wrong. He was her husband, and she had frightened him away. She had frightened love away, precious love, and that couldn't be good. Was not Lottie right when she said the other day that nothing at all, except love, mattered? Nothing certainly seemed much use unless it was built up on love. But once frightened away, could it ever come back? Yes, it might. And that beauty, it might in the atmosphere of happiness. Lottie and San Salvatore seemed between them to spread round like some divine infection. She had, however, to get him there first, and he certainly couldn't be got there if she didn't write and tell him where she was. She would write. She must write, for if she did, there was at least a chance of his coming, and if she didn't, there was manifestly none. And then, once here in this loveliness, with everything so soft and kind and sweet all round, it would be easier to tell him, to try and explain, to ask for something different, for at least an attempt at something different in their lives in the future, instead of the blankness of separation, the cold of nothing at all, but the great windiness of faith, the great bleakness of works. Why, one person in the world, one single person belonging to one, of one's very own, to talk to take care of, to love, to be interested in, was worth more than all the speeches on platforms and the compliments of chairmen in the world. It was also worth more. Rose couldn't help it. The thought would come. Then all the prayers. These thoughts were not head thoughts, like Scraps, who was altogether free from yearnings, but bosom thoughts. They lodged in the bosom. It was in the bosom that Rose ached and felt so dreadfully lonely, and when her courage failed her, as it did on most days, and it seemed impossible to write to Frederick, she would look at Mr. Wilkins and revive. There he was, a changed man. There he was, going into that small, uncomfortable room every night. That room whose proximities had been Lottie's only misgiving, and coming out of it in the morning, and Lottie coming out of it too, both of them as unclouded, and as nice to each other as when they went in. And hadn't he so critical at home, Lottie had told her of the least thing going wrong. Emerged from the vast catastrophe as untouched in spirit, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were untouched in body when they emerged from the fire. Miracles were happening in this place. If they could happen to Mr. Wilkins, why not to Frederick? She got up quickly. Yes, she would write. She would go and write to him at once. But suppose she paused. Suppose he didn't answer. Suppose he didn't even answer. And she sat down again to think a little longer. In these hesitations did Rose spend most of the second week. Then there was Mrs. Fisher. Her restlessness increased that second week. It increased to such an extent that she might just as well not have had her private sitting room at all, for she could no longer sit. Not for 10 minutes together could Mrs. Fisher sit. And added to the restlessness, as the days of the second week proceeded on their way, she had a curious sensation, which worried her, of rising sap. She knew the feeling, because she had sometimes had it in childhood, in specially swift springs, when the lilacs and the syringas seemed to rush out into blossom in a single night. But it was strange to have it again after over 50 years. She would have liked to remark on the sensation to someone, but she was ashamed. It was such an absurd sensation at her age. Yet oftener and oftener, and every day more and more, did Mrs. Fisher have a ridiculous feeling, as if she were presently going to burgeon. Sternly she tried to frown the unseemly sensation down. Burgeon indeed. She had heard of dried staffs, pieces of near dead wood, suddenly putting forth fresh leaves, but only in legend. She was not in legend. She knew perfectly what was due to herself. Dignity demanded that she should have nothing to do with fresh leaves at her age, and yet there it was, the feeling that presently, that at any moment now, she might crop out all green. Mrs. Fisher was upset. There were many things she disliked more than anything else, and one was when the elderly imagined they felt young and behaved accordingly. Of course, they only imagined it. They were only deceiving themselves. But how deplorable were the results? She herself had grown old, as people should grow old. Steadily and firmly. No interruptions, no belated afterglows and spasmodic returns. If, after all these years, she were now going to be deluded into some sort of unsuitable breaking out, how humiliating. Indeed, she was thankful. The second week, that Kate Lumley was not there. It would be most unpleasant, should anything different occur in her behavior, to have Kate looking on. Kate had known her all her life. She felt she could let herself go. Here, Mrs. Fisher frowned at the book she was vainly trying to concentrate on, for where did that expression come from? Much less painfully before strangers than before an old friend. Old friends, reflected Mrs. Fisher, who hoped she was reading, compare one constantly with what one used to be. They are always doing it if one develops. They are surprised at development. They hark back. They expect motionlessness after, say, 50, to the end of one's days. That, thought Mrs. Fisher, her eyes going steadily, line by line, down the page, and not a word of it getting through into her consciousness, is foolish of friends. It is condemning one to a premature death. One should continue, of course with dignity, to develop, however old one may be. She had nothing against developing, against further ripeness, because as long as one was alive, one was not dead, obviously, decided Mrs. Fisher, and development, change, ripening were life. What she would dislike would be unripening, going back to something green. She would dislike it intensely. And this is what she felt she was on the brink of doing. Naturally, it made her very uneasy, and only in constant movement could she find distraction. Increasingly restless and no longer able to confine herself to her battlements, she wandered more and more frequently, and also aimlessly, in and out of the top garden, to the growing surprise of Scrap. Especially when she found that all Mrs. Fisher did was to stare for a few minutes at the view, pick a few dead leaves off the rose bushes, and go away again. In Mr. Wilkins's conversation, she found temporary relief, but though he joined her whenever he could, he was not always there, for he spread his attentions judiciously. And when he was somewhere else, she had to face and manage her thoughts, as best she could, by herself. Perhaps it was the excess of light and color at San Salvatore, which made every other place seem dark and black. and Prince of Wales Terrace did seem a very dark black spot to have to go back to. A dark, narrow street, and her house dark and narrow as the street, with nothing really living or young in it. The goldfish could hardly be called living, or at most not more than half living, and were certainly not young, and except for them, there were only the maids. And they were dusty old things. Dusty old things. Mrs. Fisher paused in her thoughts, arrested by this strange expression. Where had it come from? How was it possible for it to come at all? It might have been one of Mrs. Wilkins's in its levity, its almost slang. Perhaps it was one of hers, and she had heard her say it, and unconsciously caught it from her. If so, this was both serious and disgusting. That the foolish creature should penetrate into Mrs. Fisher's very mind and establish her personality there, the personality which was still, in spite of the harmony, apparently existing between her and her intelligent husband. So alien to Mrs. Fisher's own, so far removed from what she understood and liked, and infect her with her undesirable phrases, was most disturbing. Never in her life before had such a sentence come into Mrs. Fisher's head. Never in her life before had she thought of her maids or of anybody else as dusty old things. Her maids were not dusty old things. They were most respectable, neat women who were allowed the use of the bathroom every Saturday night. Elderly, certainly, but then so was she. So was her house. So was her furniture. So were her goldfish. They were all elderly, as they should be, together. But there was a great difference between being elderly and being a dusty old thing. How true it was, what Ruskin said, that evil communications corrupt good manners. But did Ruskin say it? On second thought, she was not sure, but it was just the sort of thing he would have said if he had said it. And in any case, that was true. Merely hearing Mrs. Wilkins' evil communications at meals. She did not listen. She avoided listening. Yet it was evident she had heard. Those communications, which, in that they so often were at once vulgar, indelicate, and profane. And always, she was sorry to say, laughed at by Lady Caroline, must be classed as evil, as spoiling her own mental manners. Soon, she might not only think but say. How terrible that would be. If that were the form her breaking out was going to take, the form of unseemly speech, Mrs. Fisher was afraid she would hardly with any degree of composure be able to bear it. At this stage, Mrs. Fisher wished more than ever that she were able to talk over her strange feelings with someone who would understand. There was, however, no one who would understand, except Mrs. Wilkins herself. She would. She would know at once, Mrs. Fisher was sure, what she felt like. But this was impossible. It would be abject, as begging the very microbe that was infecting one for protection against its disease. She continued accordingly to bear her sensations in silence, and was driven by them into that frequent aimless appearing in the top garden, which presently roused even Scrap's attention. Scrap had noticed it, and vaguely wondered at it, for some time before Mr. Wilkins inquired of her one morning, as he arranged her cushions for her. He had established the daily assisting of Lady Caroline into her chair as his special privilege, whether there was anything the matter with Mrs. Fisher. At that moment, Mrs. Fisher was standing by the eastern parapet. shading her eyes and carefully scrutinizing the distant lighthouses of Mexico. They could see her through the branches of the daphnes. "I don't know," said Scrap. "She is a lady, I take it," said Mr. Wilkins.
Who would be unlikely to have anything on her mind?
"I should imagine so," said Scrap, smiling.
If she has, and her restlessness appears to suggest it, I should be more than glad to assist her with advice.
"I am sure you would be most kind. Of course she has her own legal advisor, but he is not on the spot." "I am." "And a lawyer on the spot," said Mr. Wilkins, who endeavored to make his conversation, when he talked to Lady Caroline light, aware that one must be light with young ladies, is worth to win. "We won't be ordinary and complete the proverb that saved London." "You should ask her. Ask her if she needs assistance. Would you advise it?"
Would it not be a little delicate to touch on such a question? The question whether or no a lady has something on her mind.
"Perhaps she will tell you if you go and talk to her." "I think it must be lonely to be Mrs. Fisher."
"You are all thoughtfulness and consideration," declared Mr. Wilkins, wishing for the first time in his life that he were a foreigner, so that he might respectfully kiss her hand on withdrawing to go obediently. It was wonderful what a variety of exits from her corner Scrap contrived for Mr. Wilkins.
Each morning she found a different one, which sent him off pleased after he had arranged her cushions for her. She allowed him to arrange the cushions, because she instantly had discovered, the very first 5 minutes of the very first evening, that her fears lest he should cling to her and stare in dreadful admiration were baseless. Mr. Wilkins did not admire like that. It was not only she instinctively felt not in him, but if it had been, he would not have dared to in her case. He was all respectfulness. She could direct his movements and regard to herself with the raising of an eyelash. His one concern was to obey. She had been prepared to like him, if he would only be so obliging as not to admire her, and she did like him. She did not forget his moving defenselessness the first morning in his towel, and he amused her, and he was kind to Lotty. It is true she liked him most when he wasn't there, but then she usually liked everybody most when they weren't there. Certainly he did seem to be one of those men, rare in her experience, who never looked at a woman from the predatory angle. The comfort of this, the simplification it brought into the relations of the party, was immense. From this point of view, Mr. Wilkins was simply ideal. He was unique and precious. Whenever she thought of him, and was perhaps inclined to dwell on the aspects of him that were a little boring, she remembered this and murmured, "But what a treasure!" Indeed, it was Mr. Wilkins's one aim during his stay at San Salvatore to be a treasure. At all costs, the 3 ladies who were not his wife must like him and trust him. Then presently, when trouble arose in their lives, and in what lives did not trouble sooner or later arise, they would recollect how reliable he was and how sympathetic, and turn to him for advice. Ladies with something on their minds were exactly what he wanted. Lady Caroline, he judged, had nothing on hers at the moment but so much beauty, for he could not but see what was evident must have had its difficulties in the past, and would have more of them before it had done. In the past, he had not been at hand. In the future, he hoped to be. And meanwhile, the behavior of Mrs. Fisher, the next in importance of the ladies from the professional point of view, showed definite promise. was almost certain that Mrs. Fisher had something on her mind. He had been observing her attentively, and it was almost certain. With the third, with Mrs. Arbuthnot, he had up to this made least headway, for she was so very retiring and quiet. But might not this very retiringness, this tendency to avoid the others and spend her time alone, indicate that she too was troubled? If so, he was her man. He would cultivate her. He would follow her and sit with her, and encourage her to tell him about herself. Arbuthnot, he understood from Lotty, was a British Museum official. Nothing specially important at present, but Mr. Wilkins regarded it as his business to know all sorts and kinds. Besides, there was promotion. Arbuthnot, promoted, might become very much worthwhile. As for Lotty, she was charming. She really had all the qualities he had credited her with during his courtship, and they had been, it appeared, merely in abeyance since. His early impressions of her were now being endorsed by the affection and even admiration Lady Caroline showed for her. Lady Caroline Dester was the last person, he was sure, to be mistaken on such a subject. Her knowledge of the world, her constant association with only the best, must make her quite unerring. Lotty was evidently, then, that which before marriage he had believed her to be. She was valuable. She certainly had been most valuable in introducing him to Lady Caroline and Mrs. Fisher. A man in his profession could be immensely helped by a clever and attractive wife. Why had she not been attractive sooner? Why this sudden flowering? Mr. Wilkins began, too, to believe there was something peculiar, as Lotty had almost at once informed him, in the atmosphere of San Salvatore. It promoted expansion. It brought out dormant qualities. And feeling more and more pleased, and even charmed by his wife, and very content with the progress he was making with the two others, and hopeful of progress to be made with the retiring third, Mr. Wilkins could not remember ever having had such an agreeable holiday. The only thing that might perhaps be bettered is the way they would call him Mr. Wilkins. Nobody said Mr. Mellersh Wilkins. Yet he had introduced himself to Lady Caroline. He flinched a little on remembering the circumstances, as Mellersh Wilkins. Still, this was a small matter, not enough to worry about. He would be foolish if in such a place and such society he worried about anything. He was not even worrying about what the holiday was costing. He had made up his mind to pay not only his own expenses, but his wife's as well, and surprised her at the end to present her with her nest egg as intact as when she started. And just the knowledge that he was preparing a happy surprise for her made him feel warmer than ever towards her. In fact, Mr. Wilkins, who had begun by being consciously and according to plan on his best behavior, remained on it unconsciously and with no effort at all. And meanwhile, the beautiful golden days were dropping gently from the second week, one by one, equal on beauty with those of the first, and the scent of bean fields and flower on the hillside behind the village came across to San Salvatore whenever the air moved. In the garden that second week, the poet's eye of Narcissus disappeared out the long grass at the edge of the zigzag path, and wild gladiolus, slender and rose-colored, came in their stead, White pinks bloomed in the borders, filling the whole place with their smoky sweet smell. And a bush nobody had noticed burst into glory and fragrance. And it was a purple lilac bush. Such a jumble of spring and summer was not to be believed in, except by those who dwelt in those gardens. Everything seemed to be out together, all the things crowded into 1 month, which in England are spread penuriously over 6. Even primroses were found, one day by Mrs. Wilkins, in a cold corner up in the hills. And when she brought them down to the geraniums and heliotrope of San Salvatore, they looked quite shy. Chapter 17. On the first day of the 3rd week, Rose wrote to Frederick, in case she should again hesitate and not post the letter. She gave it to Domenico to post. For if she did not write now, there would be no time left at all. Half the month at San Salvatore was over. Even if Frederick started directly, he got the letter, which of course he wouldn't be able to do. What with packing and passport? Besides not being in a hurry to come, he couldn't arrive for 5 days. Having done it, Rose wished she hadn't. He wouldn't come. He wouldn't bother to answer. And if he did answer, it would just be giving some reason, which was not true, and about being too busy to get away. And all that had been got by writing to him would be that she would be more unhappy than before. What things one did when one was idle. This resurrection of Frederick, or rather this attempt to resurrect him, what was it but the result of having nothing whatever to do? She wished she had never come away on a holiday. What did she want with holidays? Work was her salvation. Work was the only thing that protected one, but kept one steady and one's values true. At home in Hampstead, absorbed and busy, she had managed to get over Frederick, thinking of him latterly only with the gentle melancholy with which one thinks of someone once loved but long since dead. And now this place, idleness in this soft place, had thrown her back to the wretched state she had climbed so carefully out of years ago. Why, if Frederick did come, she would only bore. Hadn't she seen, in a flash, quite seen, after getting to San Salvatore, that was really what kept him away from her? And why should she suppose that now, after such a long estrangement, she would be able not to bore him, be able to do anything but stand before him like a tongue-tied idiot, with all the fingers of her spirit turned into thumbs? Besides, what a hopeless position to have, as it were, to beseech. Please wait a little. Please don't be impatient. I think perhaps I shan't be a bore presently. 1,000 times a day, Rose wished she had let Frederick alone. Lotty, who asked her every evening whether she had sent her letter yet, exclaimed with delight when the answer at last was yes, and threw her arms round her. Now we shall be completely happy. Cried the enthusiastic Lotty. But nothing seemed less certain to Rose, and her expression became more and more the expression of one who has something on her mind. Mr. Wilkins, wanting to find out what it was, strolled in the sun in his Panama hat and began to meet her accidentally. I did not know, said Mr. Wilkins, the first time, courteously raising his hat, that you too liked this particular spot. And he sat down beside her. In the afternoon, she chose another spot, and she had not been in it half an hour before Mr. Wilkins, lightly swinging his cane, came round the corner. "We are destined to meet in our rambles," said Mr. Wilkins pleasantly, and he sat down beside her. Mr. Wilkins was very kind, and she had, she saw, misjudged him in Hampstead. And this was the real man, ripened like fruit by the beneficent sun of San Salvatore. But Rose did want to be alone. Still, she was grateful to him for proving to her that though she might bore Frederick, she did not bore everybody. If she had, he would not have sat talking to her on each occasion till it was time to go in to those news. True, he bored her. But that wasn't anything like so dreadful as if she bored him. Then, indeed, her vanity would have been sadly ruffled. For now that Rose was not able to say her prayers, she was being assailed by every sort of weakness, vanity, sensitiveness, irritability, pugnacity, strange, unfamiliar doubt. She had never been vain or irritable or pugnacious in her life before. Could it be that San Salvatore was capable of opposite effects, and the same sun that ripened Mr. Wilkins made her go acid? The next morning, so as to be sure of being alone, she went down. While Mr. Wilkins was still lingering pleasantly with Mrs. Fisher over breakfast, to the rocks by the water's edge where she and Lotty had sat the first day. Frederick, by now, had got her letter. Today, if he were like Mr. Wilkins, she might get a telegram from him. She tried to silence the absurd hope by jeering at it. Yet, if Mr. Wilkins had telegraphed, why not Frederick? The spell of San Salvatore lurked even, it seemed, in notepaper. Lotty had not dreamed of getting a telegram, and when she came in at lunchtime, there it was. It would be too wonderful if when she went back at lunchtime, she found one there for her too. Rose clasped her hands tight round her knees. How passionately she longed to be important to somebody again. Detective, how pumping, not important on platforms, not important as an asset in an organization, but privately important, just to one other person. Quite privately, nobody else to know or notice. It didn't seem much to ask in a world so crowded with people just to have one of them, only one out of all the millions, to oneself. Somebody who needed one. He thought of one. He was eager to come to one. Ah, how dreadfully one wanted to be precious. All the morning she sat beneath the pine tree by the sea. Nobody came near her. The great hours passed slowly. They seemed enormous. But she wouldn't go up before lunch. She would give the telegram time to arrive. That day Scrap, egged on by Lottie's persuasions, and also thinking that perhaps she had sat long enough, had arisen from her chair and cushions and gone off with Lottie and sandwiches up into the hills till evening. Mr. Wilkins, who wished to go with them, stayed on Lady Caroline's advice with Mrs. Fisher in order to cheer her solitude. And though he left off, cheering her about 11, to go and look for Mrs. Arbuthnot, so as for a space to cheer her too. Thus dividing himself impartially between these solitary ladies, he came back again, presently mopping his forehead, and continued with Mrs. Fisher where he had left off, for this time Mrs. Arbuthnot had hidden successfully. There was a telegram, too, for her he noticed when he came in. Pity, he did not know where she was. Ought we to open it? He said to Mrs. Fisher. No, said Mrs. Fisher. It may require an answer. I don't approve of tampering with other people's correspondence. Tampering. My dear lady, Mr. Wilkins was shocked. Such a word. Tampering. He had the greatest possible esteem for Mrs. Fisher, but he did at times find her a little difficult. She liked him, he was sure, and she was in a fair way, he felt, to become a client. But he feared she would be a headstrong and secretive client. She was certainly secretive, for though he had been skillful and sympathetic for a whole week, she had as yet given him no inkling of what was so evidently worrying her. Poor old thing, said Lotty, on his asking her if she perhaps could throw light on Mrs. Fisher's troubles. She hasn't that love. Love? Mr. Wilkins could only echo, genuinely scandalized. But surely, my dear, at her age. Any love, said Lotty. That very morning he had asked his wife, for he now sought and respected her opinion, if she could tell him what was the matter with Mrs. Arbuthnot. For she, too, though he had done his best to thaw her into confidences, had remained persistently retiring. She wants her husband, said Lotty. Ah, said Mr. Wilkins, a new light shed on Mrs. Arbuthnot's shy and modest melancholy. And he added, very proper. And Lotty said, smiling at him, one does. And Mr. Wilkins said, smiling at her, does one? And Lotty said, smiling at him, of course. Hopeless. And Mr. Wilkins, much pleased with her, though it is still quite early in the day, a time when caresses were sluggish, pinched her ear. Just before 12:30 Rose came slowly up through the pergola and between the camellias, ranged on either side of the old stone steps. The rivulets of periwinkles that flowed down them when first she arrived were gone. And now there were these bushes, incredibly roseted, pink, white, red, striped. She fingered and smelt them one after the other, so as not to get to her disappointment too quickly. As long as she hadn't seen for herself, seen the table in the hall quite empty, except for its bowl of flowers, she still could hope. She still could have the joy of imagining the telegram lying on it waiting for her. But there is no smell in a camellia, as Mr. Wilkins, who was standing in the doorway on the lookout for her and knew what was necessary in horticulture, reminded her. She started at his voice and looked up. A telegram has come for you, said Mr. Wilkins. She stared at him, her mouth open. I searched for you everywhere, but failed. Of course. She knew it. So she had been sure of it all the time. Bright and burning, youth in that instant flashed down again on Rose. She flew up the steps, red as the camellia she had just been fingering, and was in the hall, and Terry opened the telegram before Mr. Wilkins had finished his sentence. Why? But if things could happen like this, why, that there was no end to. Why, she and Frederick, they were going to be again, at last. And no bad news, I trust. But, said Mr. Wilkins, who had followed her, for when she had read the telegram, she stood staring at it, and her face went slowly white. 7. Curious to watch how her face went slowly white. She turned and looked at Mr. Wilkins, as if trying to remember him. Oh, no. On the contrary, She managed to smile. "I'm going to have a visitor," she said, holding out the telegram. And when he had taken it, she walked away towards the dining room, murmuring something about lunch being ready. Mr. Wilkins read the telegram. It had been sent that morning from Mexico and was, "I am passing through on way to Rome. May I pay my respects this afternoon? Thomas Briggs." Why should such a telegram make the interesting lady turn pale? For her pallor on reading, it had been so striking as to convince Mr. Wilkins she was receiving a blow. "Who is Thomas Briggs?" he asked, following her into the dining room. She looked at him vaguely. "Who is?" she repeated, getting her thoughts together again. "Thomas Briggs. Yes. He is the owner. This is his house. He's very nice. He is coming this afternoon." Thomas Briggs was at that very moment coming. He was jogging along the road between Mezzago and Castagneto in a fly, sincerely hoping that the dark-eyed lady would grasp that all he wanted was to see her, and not at all to see if his house were still there. He felt that an owner of delicacy did not intrude on a tenant, but great chance, do how she possibly died. Let her take Angel Joy and Arimaska She married so much of herself to him, taking a great deal as she was looking Rose Arbuthnot. Such a pretty name. And that's the creature of life. And such a pretty creature. Such a mild, milky, motherly. The best sense being that she wasn't his mother and couldn't have been if she had tried, for parents were the only things impossible to have other than oneself. Also, he was passing so near. It seemed absurd not just to look in and see if she were comfortable. He longed to see her in his house. He longed to see it as her background, to see her sitting in his chairs, drinking out of his cups, using all his things. Did she put the big crimson bouquet cushion in the drawing room behind her little dark head? Her hair and the whiteness of her skin would look lovely against it. Had she seen herself in the portrait of herself on the stairs? He wondered if she liked it. He would explain it to her. If she didn't paint, and she had said nothing to suggest it, she wouldn't perhaps notice how exactly the molding of the eyebrows and the slight hollow of the cheek. He told the fly to wait in Castagneto and cross the piazza, hailed by children and dogs, who all knew him and sprang up suddenly from nowhere, and walking quickly up the zigzag path, for he was an active young man, not much more than 30. He pulled the ancient chain that rang the bell, and waited decorously on the proper side of the open door to be allowed to come in. At the sight of him, Francesca flung up every bit of her that would fling up eyebrows, eyelids, and hands, and volubly assured him that all was in perfect order and that she was doing her duty. Of course, said Briggs, cutting her short. No one doubts it. And he asked her to take in his card to her mistress. Which mistress? Asked Francesca. Which mistress? There are 4, said Francesca, scenting an irregularity on her part of the tenants. For her, Master looked surprised, and she felt pleased, for life was dull, and their regularities helped it along at least a little. 4? He repeated, surprised. Well, take it to the lot then, he said, recovering himself, for he noticed her expression. Coffee was being drunk in the top garden, in the shade of the umbrella pine. Only Mrs. Fisher and Mr. Wilkins were drinking it, for Mrs. Arbuthnot, after eating nothing and being completely silent during lunch, had disappeared immediately afterwards. While Francesco went away into the garden with his card, her master stood examining the picture on the staircase of that Madonna by an early Italian painter, name unknown, picked up by him at Orvieto, who was so much like his tenant. It really was remarkable. The likeness. Of course, his tenant that day in London had had her hat on, but he was pretty sure her hair grew just like that off her forehead. The expression of the eyes, grave and sweet, was exactly the same. He rejoiced to think that he would always have her portrait. He looked up at the sound of footsteps, and there she was, coming down the stairs, just as he had imagined her in that place, dressed in white. She was astonished to see him so soon. She had supposed that he would come about tea time. Until then, she had meant to sit somewhere out of doors where she could be by herself. He watched her coming down the stairs with the utmost eager interest. In a moment, she would be level with her portrait. It really is extraordinary, said Briggs. How do you do? Said Rose, intent only on a decent show of welcome. She did not welcome him. He was here. She felt the telegram bitter in her heart instead of Frederick, doing what she had longed Frederick would do, taking his place. Just stand still a moment. She obeyed automatically. Yes, quite astonishing. Do you mind taking off your hat? Rose, surprised, took it off obediently. Yes, I thought so. I just wanted to make sure. And look, have you noticed? He began to make odd, swift passes, with his hand over the face in the picture, measuring it, looking from it to her. Rosa's surprise became amusement, and she could not help smiling. Have you come to compare me with my original? She asked. You do see how extraordinarily alike. I didn't know I looked so solemn. You don't. Not now. You did a minute ago. Quite as solemn. Oh, yes, how do you do? He finished suddenly, noticing her outstretched hand. And he laughed and shook it, flushing, a trick of his, to the roots of his fair hair. Francesca came back. The Signor Fisher, she said, will be pleased to see him. Who is the Signora Fisher? He asked Rose. One of the 4 who are sharing your house. Then there are 4 of you. Yes. My friend and I found we couldn't afford it by ourselves. Oh, I say, began Briggs in confusion, for he would best have liked Rose Arbuthnot. Pretty name not to have to afford anything, but to stay at San Salvatore as long as she liked us as guest. Mrs. Fisher is having coffee in the top garden, said Rose. I'll take you to her and introduce you. I don't want to go. You've got your hat on, so you were going for a walk. Mayn't I come too? I'd immensely like being shown round by you. But Mrs. Fisher is waiting for you.
Oh, she keep...
Yes, said Rose, with the smile that had so much attracted him the first day. I think she will keep quite well, Dilty. Do you speak Italian? No, said Rose. Why? On that he turned to Francesca and told her at a great rate, for in Italian he was glib, to go back to the Signora in the top garden and tell her he had encountered his old friend, the Signora Arbuthnot, and was going for a walk with her and would present himself to her later. Do you invite me to tea? He asked Rose when Francesca had gone. Of course. It's your house. It isn't. It's yours. Till Monday week, she smiled. Come and show me all the views, he said eagerly. And it was plain, even to the self-depreciatory Rose, that she did not bore Mr. Briggs.